You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Randall T. Shepard. He was appointed to the Indiana Supreme Court by Governor Robert Orr in 1985 at the age of 38. He became Chief Justice of Indiana in March 1987, retired from the court in March 2012. Time he was the longest serving Chief Justice in Indiana history. Still true?
I believe so, yeah.
And the senior Chief Justice in the country's state Supreme Courts.
Yes. Well, longest serving.
Correct.
Wasn't the oldest. Yeah.
That's a better way to put it. Thank you very much. He is a seventh generation Hoosier and an Eagle Scout. Must make Jim Morris happy.
Yes.
He graduated from Princeton University in 1969. So you were there at the same time as Mitch Daniels?
We knew each other. Mitch Daniels was 2 years behind me, and we still communicate every now and then.
He's been on the podcast a couple times. Terrific guest.
Mm-hmm.
I also just interviewed someone, the greatest, or probably the most widely praised Lincoln scholar in the world, and that's Michael Burlingame.
I have met him, I believe, but I don't actually know him sort of day by day.
Princeton grad, I think maybe a couple years ahead of you, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Were you there when George Will was there?
No, I'm a little too young for George Will. George Will would have, I think, left before I did.
And how were you able to keep up with the academic comet that is Graham Richard?
Well, he and I, of course, were classmates, and my goodness, Graham and I we studied the same subjects at Princeton, and occasionally would find ourselves in the library section at the same time, working on a paper or reading our assignments, and we've known each other ever since. I had the great privilege to administer the oath of office when he became mayor of Fort Wayne. Went up to Fort Wayne and swore him in, and I only see him every couple of years now. But my goodness, what a wonderful collection of achievements and interests that are a part of Graham Richard's life.
I had a Zoom conversation with him about a week before we record this podcast, and he was going on and on about you as a person, as an intellect, as a judge. And so I couldn't resist. I told him, I said, well, I'll bring up your academic record versus his. And he started laughing. He goes, please don't.
Well, I'll tell you a story that has to do with both of us, but not until we're done.
Yes, sir. There's another famous person who we talked about before who's connected to you, obviously. You graduated from Yale Law School in 1972. Did you have any famous people walking down the halls with you?
I had multiple, of course. I began as a classmate of Hillary Rodham. She ended up graduating a year later because Bill came a year or two later, he'd been at Oxford. Mm-hmm. And so the two of them became an item, and that meant that Hillary needed to stay in New Haven while Bill finished. And that's when she worked particularly on this book. It Takes a Village was part of what she did then. And she also went to work as a staff member for the Great Watergate Investigation Committee down in D.C.
Sam Dash, I think, was the one she worked for. Is that right?
Yeah, that might be right. So I knew both Bill and Hillary. Not that we partied around late on Fridays, but it was
like Bill's a pretty good person to party with.
Yeah. Well, it's a pretty small place, the Yale Law School. There were, I think I was in what at that moment was the biggest class they'd ever had, which was 205 or something, which isn't very big for a law school. So you see people hanging around in the halls and going to their next class and chatting and so on. Did
you stay in contact with him when he became governor, or?
It was more with her. I would see her every once in a great while. And the other person, of course, who was there and I didn't know, but I certainly recognized when I saw him on TV was Clarence Thomas. I think he was a first-year student when I was a third-year student.
And you all just don't talk to first-year students?
No, you just don't get around to meet everybody, for heaven's sakes. And in fact, I didn't live in the law school as a third-year student, which would have meant I'd have had a better shot at spending more time. But there were, and of course, what that meant is there were plenty of people in and around my law school class who ended up holding federal positions during the Clinton administration. So they were, it all, I think knowing who they were, I think the country was well served.
We interviewed David Frick.
Yes.
A couple of years ago.
Yeah.
The amazing David Frick.
That's a good way of putting his career. We've all been, the city in particular, but the state in general, very fortunate.
There should be a statue to David Frick somewhere in the city of Indianapolis.
Yes.
Probably right outside the convention center or the Lucas Oil Stadium.
Well, there is the Bill Hudnut bench over here. Perhaps the two of the Bill sitting on one end, and perhaps David could sit on the other.
David told us that he was in law school with Stephen Breyer. I think he said he was a couple years ahead.
Wow.
Is it different to go to an East Side? I mean, an East Coast. I mean, I know that's kind of all you know but you're from Indiana. You matriculate out to Princeton, which is in New Jersey, then go to Yale, which is in Connecticut.
Mm-hmm.
Did you feel like you belonged? I don't know how the way to put it. I mean, those are premier institutions, and sometimes they don't always look at folks who are outside their zip code with the greatest benignness.
Well, I think there were. In my Princeton class, I think there were 7 people and that was a class of 800. I think there were 7 from Indiana, maybe 8. And one of the reasons I went to Princeton is that it's in a much smaller community as compared to New Haven or Cambridge. It's in a relatively small town. One of the jokes people used to tell was that Princeton was a place where the people who were running away from New York ran into the people who were running away from Philadelphia. And there was a little truth to that. It was the other line was, this will tell you how long ago it was. This is a place where you can buy an $80,000 house for $100,000. But it does take some getting used to. The other part of it was, of course, that a fair number of the students in my freshman class were people who'd gone to residential prep schools, about which I knew practically nothing. But some of them have turned out to be good friends. I'm going to be going off on vacation in a couple of weeks, and I'll visit with a gentleman who also went to law school eventually. He was one of my roommates, and he was a classic Phillips Andover son of a law partner sort of guy. But we got along. We ultimately became very good friends. But it does take a little. But part of the reason I chose Princeton was because I thought it was going to be easier to adjust coming from a Midwest city, and Princeton doesn't have a law school, so that's part of the reason I looked elsewhere.
And how soon after you were there first, how soon after Mitch Daniels got there, for example, did you guys connect and say, oh my God, we're from, a couple of Hoosiers out here in New Jersey trying to...
Well, pretty close, because we were in the college Republicans, and they would have regular meetings. Now, I don't have it seared in my brain whether it was his, club introduction period during his first year, and by that time, I would have been a board member, I think, of the Princeton College Republicans. And so we would know each other and hang around pretty much the whole time.
And the other person I could think of who went to Princeton, who's made his mark on Indianapolis, is Scott Newman.
Sure.
And I imagine he's a few years younger than you.
I didn't know Scott Newman. I do now. I have.
When you meet someone who goes, let's say, to Princeton or Yale Law, do you feel an immediate connection with them?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, you know that you had experiences in terms of what was the place like and which choices did you have to make. I mean, in those days, one of the choices you had to make, although it wasn't entirely your choice, was they didn't have fraternities at Princeton, and actually they didn't have real fraternities at Yale either. So they had what they called clubs, and the clubs all had homes. They had there was a street with about 10 of them lined up next to each other, and that's what you made that choice as a sophomore, and then you went to the club wherever you ended up, and that was a place where you'd actually take your meals. You wouldn't go to the main cafeteria any longer. You'd take your meals, as they would say, or become a member of a given club, and then that's also that's where you went to parties. The club would have its own parties and that sort of stuff. So, yeah, you know that you're depending on the era. Of course, I graduated from Princeton I graduated in June, and the first women were admitted in September. So when I was there, Princeton was an all-male deal, and we, of course, complained to each other that we just barely missed.
You tell your Wabash friends?
Yeah, right. Got a lot of those, happily.
So at one point, Mitch Daniels, graduate of Princeton, was governor of Indiana. Randy Shepard, graduate of Princeton, Chief Justice of Indiana. Does that give you bragging rights when you go see other Ivy Leaguers or other college people? Because, there's the Wabash, DePaul, Armageddon.
My parents met at DePaul, so I have to lean on that end of that debate rather loyally. I think say that again, because I thought I had an answer and I've now botched it.
Mitch Daniels was governor.
Oh yeah. No, the thing that was most amazing about it was that we had ended up right in the same building. I mean, the office of the Chief Justice was literally on the right above the floor where the governor's desk was. And, we just look at each other and say, how in the world did this happen?
Is there a picture of the two of you that you sent to the Princeton alumni magazine?
No, I should have, but we it did make it not so much because of Princeton, but because we'd known each other for so long. I think I knew him back when he worked for Keith Buellen's communications firm, and I was working on political campaigns in Evansville. But it really was to have a lawyer who was somebody I'd known for a quarter of a century almost, something like that. It just made it easier to talk to each other and to say, here's what's really important to me, and is there something else I can do to make this happen, and is what worries you about what's going on your floor or mine.
You mentioned giving the oath of office to Graham Richard. I'm assuming you did.
Yeah. God.
Did you chuckle? Did you two chuckle at each other before you started?
Well, one thing was, as we stood up, it was out at the fairgrounds, and
the first one was
the first one was, and the one thing I learned later was that his wife had said to him, "Don't look at him while you're doing this, because you'll." And what she meant was, you're both going to break down, and that's probably was right. Just old times and old friendships mean a lot. So there's one time, one of my favorite little moments was during a State of the Judiciary address, and which the Chief Justice usually gives the day or maybe 2 days after the State of the State address by the governor, and the governor comes. Bob Orr was the first governor in anybody's memory to come. I called him and said, I'm giving my second State of the Judiciary address. Will you come? And he said, sure, I will. And since then, governors have always considered that a part of the building block of good relationships. So Mitch Daniels was sitting over here, maybe 5 feet away on the podium, and one of the things I was reporting to the legislature was a reform that we had just finished called plain English jury instructions, because the jury instructions that we read to jurors are most of them been around a long time. They've been amended now and then, and they're all written by lawyers to make sure we've covered all the legal bases and so on. And there were one or two other states that had decided what we're going to do is take these instructions and we're going to go back over them. We're not changing any law, but we're changing the language so that these citizens who come and sit in the jury box can understand what it is we're telling them about law. And I said, now let me give you, for instance, this is in the speech, and Mitch is sitting over here, and Becky Skillman is sitting on the other side. And I said, well, now here's an example. We've been for decades, we've been giving this instruction on the difference between direct evidence and indirect evidence. I said, and what it says is direct evidence is evidence that comes directly from an event that happened and then which can be directly attributed to. Indirect evidence, I said, nobody knows what that means. Here's what it now says. Direct evidence that a rabbit ran through the snow comes from somebody who watched the rabbit run through the snow. Indirect evidence comes from somebody who saw the rabbit's tracks in the snow. And, of course, people start chuckling around it. And Mitch looks over at me and says, wait, I don't get it. and I looked over and said, they didn't cover that at Georgetown? Surely I thought they'd have done that.
We've recorded our first podcast with him. I think he said, Chris, that he malpracticed law. I think it's the word he used. Let's talk a little bit about politics.
Doubt that.
When did you first catch the bug of politics, and who were some of your political influences growing up? I mean, you grew up basically a baby boomer, I would think.
Yes.
And, the time of some significant leaders and leadership in the United States, put Indiana aside for a little bit, but who kind of helped you with your political philosophy and leanings?
Well, I just yesterday or today thought about the first sort of political thing that I remember. I was invited to spend the night with some friends of my parents. My parents had to be away, and so they threw an election night party the night that Dwight D. Eisenhower ran for re-election against Governor Stevenson. And I was in about the third grade. Maybe I'd have to stop and think about that. This was 1956, so I was probably a little older than that. I was just delighted that I got to stay up. And then they finally told me, the friends of my parents said, you're going to school tomorrow. You got to go to bed. What they forgot was that there was a radio in the room. So I had some interest in this from the beginning. None of my recent family, some of my ancestors had careers in public service, but I think the person who sort of brought me into the field was a man named Roger Zion, was the first person I ever did volunteer work and then staff work. And he ran for Congress from Evansville once in the '64 election as a Republican.
Oops.
That was that didn't work as well as he hoped. But then but it worked well enough that he decided to run again in '66, and he beat an incumbent who'd been there 5 or 6 terms.
66 was a good year for Republicans.
Was a good year.
64 was not.
Exactly right. So Roger invited me to become the next time he ran in '68, I was his campaign manager during the summer months, and then I had to go back to college. We were our offices the first time around were in what was then the Republican headquarters in downtown Evansville. We were up on the second floor, and on the first floor was the Vanderburgh County Republican Central Committee chaired by Bob Orr. So I came to know people like that, and then ultimately got invited to come. The Republicans finally won City Hall under the leadership of a man named Russell Lloyd, whose son also later got elected mayor. And Russell Lloyd invited me to come and be his assistant. I was working in D.C. at the time, ironically in the same place where Pete Buttigieg now works. I literally was in that same office. I didn't have the same chair Pete Buttigieg has, but I was in my very first paid job as a lawyer. I worked in the U.S. Transportation Department, and I know exactly how you get to Secretary Buttigieg's office. I'm sort of hoping maybe someday I'll get a chance to go and shake his hand in his office, because I've known him. I knew him when he was.
Do you go to D.C. a lot?
No, not a lot.
Well, I imagine there's a lot of folks who can make that happen.
Yeah, that's probably right.
You're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is former Chief Justice of the Indiana Supreme Court, Randall Shepard. You mentioned Russell Lloyd, and you just mentioned Bob Orr. You know, all of us who work in politics or have worked in politics, you think back to the people who gave you a nudge or said, hey, talk to this guy. For me, it's people like P.E. McAllister.
Yeah.
The greatest.
Yeah. No, we have a lot of people to say thank you to. And
talk about those two men, particularly about how they helped your career, because maybe you got out of law school and says, hey, I just want to work in government and maybe be a judge, or, hey, I want to go do something in the private sector. I mean, these are tough decisions because when you have a law degree, quite frankly, it just opens so many doors and opportunities. Mm-hmm. And what did they help kind of steer you to public service?
You had to think that watching Bob Orr in multiple roles gave you the idea that there was work to be done that would be valuable to the state and the community, and also interesting to do if you were involved. I can remember working, I think it might have been that same year that I worked for Roger Zion in that same building. Bob Orr was maybe running for the state Senate, I think. But in any event, he was county chairman, and they were just starting to build I-64, which was, and they actually hadn't opened it yet, but he arranged a television commercial in which the Republican candidates from Vanderburgh County, with Bob in the center, come down the interstate road, talking about the need for better transportation and the need for community development, and hallelujah. And he would treat people in ways that were very fitting. He'd help recruit high school students to go to Yale College, and he'd go talk at schools. There's now a Bob Orr library in a school not up far from where he had lived during that period. And he would keep in touch. When I came back to town, I would go. He was I think the first time I actually knew who he was, he chaired there was when Barry Goldwater ran, there was a moderate Republican opponent. It's a name you'd
about Rockefeller?
No, No, I saw Rockefeller once in Pete Buttigieg's office, but that was later.
6 degrees from Pete Buttigieg.
Yeah.
I don't think Romney ran. Well, Romney was involved in 64, but may not be who you're talking about.
I think this gentleman had been governor of Pennsylvania, or
yeah, I know exactly. Just Strickler.
Yeah, that sounds that might be right. And he took up to be he opened an office on Main Street in Evansville in promoting this Republican candidate for the nomination who was running against Goldwater.
I think Goldwater ended up choosing him as his running mate in 64. Our crack research department, a.k.a. Chris Spangle, is on it as we speak. Chris, what you got? Oh, that's right. That's right. I'm sorry. He did an American Express commercial. Nobody knew who the hell he was.
It's amazing how the systems have changed now, because it used to be when you were doing a Google search, you'd put in individual words, and now you can put in a question like who ran against Rockefeller, who ran against Goldwater for the nomination in 1964. Anyway, so you just see Bob Orr, the human being, the thinker, a very elegant guy, but Scranton, Pennsylvania. William Scranton. He was the head of he opened an office for William Scranton in downtown Evansville in 64.
We did a podcast a couple of years ago about Bob Orr, governor, and the man. And our guests were Bob Grand, Darlene Sherman, and the Wallflower, otherwise known as Mark Lubbers. God love him. And one of the things that came through for all of them was just how decent he was as a man. They offered him, I think, come back to Yale, do a speech, and we'll give you your degree because you left. And he's like, no. Is that your opinion of him in a lot of ways?
Absolutely. And here's one I'll remember. I thought what you were going to say is that I had the privilege after he left office. For some reason, we gathered at a condo, I think it was, off of 86th Street, where they had lived. And he was getting stuff ready. It's not like he hired a caterer or anything. There were only 4 or 5 of us. And he pulls out this, I think it was glass, but it might have been silverish bowl. And he's pouring potato chips into it so we can pass the potato. And what I realize is it's an honorary something from Harvard.
So did you do it on purpose?
Oh, I think so. So that was classic. That was just Bob Orr, the wonderful human being.
And there's a chance when you work in administrations. I worked in the ballot administration, and you go to see your coworkers go on and do amazing things. Ryan Vaughn, Paul Okeson, Jason Dudich, Chris Cotter. I mean, the list goes on and on, right? Of course. Yeah.
Now, Russell Lloyd, of course, I left Washington to go to work for him. And I had come to know him working upstairs when Bob Orr was the party chairman. So he was sort of the young guy. I think he might have even been treasurer of the county committee. He was just wonderful to be with, and so energetic, and viewed the future of the city of Evansville as something that could be built. So there were all sorts of things that I got to do on his behalf, or that he and I went. Evansville won an award from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. He decided he wanted to go to the award ceremony, which was in D.C., so he talked one of his friends into going into, who had a plane, will you fly us to D.C.? So the friend and Mayor Lloyd and I went to D.C. for this rather modest ceremony, actually, but it was a whale of a good time.
When you go back to Evansville, what do you think of how it's transformed?
Evansville's, what I usually say is Evansville has fallen on good times.
They've had some terrific leadership.
Yes, they have. They had a series of very good mayors, and it's the city is well just to the automobile plant up the road is actually over in Gibson County, and they're now making rather fancy cars there in addition to what they were making. But it was started maybe 20 years ago. A Subaru, does that sound right? My friends in Evansville will kill me that I couldn't come up with Toyota. That's Toyota. They started that maybe 20 years ago, and they've never stopped building. It is one addition or another has been going on for now almost a generation. But that's and that helps. Part of the reason they could do that is because Mayor Lloyd said, if we extend the city's water system up US 41 to the north of the city, even outside the city, sooner or later that's going to be an advantage economically. So he did. He talked the council and the water board into spending some real money, and they built water all the way into Gibson County. So the last I knew, Toyota was still using Evansville water, Ohio River water.
You have an Evansville compatriot in the State House. When did you first meet Lieutenant Governor Suzanne Crouch?
Oh, well, quite a long time ago. We certainly while I was a trial judge. So it's been at least since it had to be before 1985. So it's been at least 35 or 40 years I've known her, and her husband, who's a lawyer, whom she always refers to as Downs. His full name is Larry Downs. Yes, we've known each other for a very long time, and I'm an admirer of hers. I think she's built an excellent record of public service and leadership, and I'm privileged to know her. I think she's doing great things for Indiana.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our guest today is former Indiana Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Randall Shepard. Is there a Hoosier leader or legend you particularly admire?
Well, how could you beat Richard Lugar?
You can't?
You can't. He was just I remember what used to be called the Indiana Association of Cities and Towns, and I would come to their meetings, sometimes with Mayor Lloyd. I'm going to give you a little bit of Mayor Lloyd. Here's the thing. When Mayor Lloyd left office, not only had he worked on water, but he'd worked on sewer and sewer plants and so on. He was particularly proud, and so was I, when he left office. The water that we were putting back into the Ohio after sewage was cleaner than the water we were taking out to use as drinking water. And that was in the 1970s. He cared about the environment. But I would go and listen to Dick Lugar when I can remember going to hear Dick Lugar give a speech at a Cities and Towns meeting, and for some reason I was there on my own. But it was worth the drive, which of course is easier now thanks to Mitch Daniels. But it was certainly worth the drive to hear Dick Lugar talk to mayors and council members from all of them smaller places, a lot of them very small places. But what he had to talk about was, how do we serve our friends and families and citizens better? And it was inspiring just to listen to him, much less to know what he was actually accomplishing.
You, I'm sure, in your career, and I want to get to your love of the law here next, but have had the occasion to speak to, I'm assuming, thousands upon thousands of college students, young people, young lawyers, etc. How do you, or did you in your speech, talk about politics? And the reason I bring that up is because it's been a long time, but I used to talk every once in a while in front of college kids or whatever, go in front of a SPIA class or something like that, journalism class. And I used to tell everyone, I don't care how you vote, get involved. One of my selling points was, and I absolutely believe this, you will meet the best people. And you'll care a hell of a lot less about their party identification the more you know them. Has that been true for you?
Yeah, I can remember an experience of going to a meeting of the Evansville City Council. I think I was still in law school, but I was home for some reason. I came to see Mayor Lloyd, and and I went in to watch the City Council, which was I think there was a Republican majority, but it was certainly a divided body. And there were, normal, what you would think of as normal or maybe a little above normal pushing and shoving between, well, now what council person said, what councilman so-and-so said can't be at all right. So it looked like a political, modest, but a political fist fight. Well, it then came time for recess in between halves of the meeting or something. And you went down the hall near the elevators and into a smaller room, open to the public, but most people didn't know it was there, was a refreshments room where you'd get chips and you could order cans of Coke and that sort of stuff. And all of them, all the Republicans and the Democrats and their staff, not everybody, but they'd all go down to this room to get something to drink while they were waiting for the next. And you'd see people patting each other on the back, or they'd turn around and say, "Do you have change for a quarter?" And just people smiling at one another. We're just working here. And I think there's a lot about Indiana that's still like that, even though today what we would say is that politics has become meaner than ever. I sometimes argue, when I talk to students or others about that, I've recently taken the position that Indiana's a little different. It's not that there isn't some pushing and shoving and an occasional punch, but when I to the extent I have a chance to compare it to the national debate, I can remember in particular. I won't give you the names because that's a little ticklish. But I can remember it was a campaign for governor, and one of the candidates ran a commercial about the activities of his opponent, and there was just a hint in the commercial, nothing brazen, but there was just a hint in the commercial that maybe that guy had taken undue benefits from a contract that he'd been a part of. Maybe he'd scraped a little off. 6 or 7 days later, he'd been talked into this by his staff, I feel sure. But the notion, Indiana was small enough, and there were enough people who knew both candidates that they knew the person who was being criticized. They start calling up the guy they're for and saying, "This is wrong. You've got to stop this." And he did. And so there was this, it was in those days it would have been 5 million people, but there were, people go to college in different places and then they transfer and they go to work for different television stations. And so I think there's still some to that in Indiana. That the language is more respectful. I'm not claiming this is ideal, but I do think that politics in Indiana is better than what people sometimes see on the national networks.
My son is going to law school. He starts this fall. I am convinced his drive to be a lawyer is 99.9% related to the fact he has seen every episode of Law and Order multiple times. What spurred your interest in the law and subsequently become a judge? Because as we were saying a few minutes ago, you have so many options.
He's chosen the right program. I recently got asked in some setting if I wanted to know what law was actually like, which of the television shows should I watch, and I don't watch Law and Order much anymore. I'm now more of an NCIS guy, but I recommended Law and Order, so he's on the right trail, and I'm not surprised that it worked well.
Did you watch Perry Mason?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. You bet. Yeah, Perry Mason. I'd have to stop and think what were some of the other programs, but I did tend to watch it. But when I left high school, I had 3 ideas in mind. One was being a lawyer. My mother had recommended that. She said law, she was absolutely right. Law will prepare you for a lot of things, including being a lawyer, but other things other than being a lawyer, that there are plenty of, and you would know, plenty of people who are in corporate work or education who went to law school. It's a good, she was right about that. And then the second one was journalism. I had been the editor of my school newspaper, and I'm still fascinated by newspapers and by modern broadcasting and communication, like podcasts. And the third was the Foreign Service, because I'd known a few people when I was a kid. I'd known some folks whose parents were in the Foreign Service, and I was interested in international events.
And your Peace Corps was proposed right about the same time?
Yeah, I think that's the Kennedy administration, isn't it? I think. I still have that interest, and part of the way I get some of that is by travel. We're not consummate travelers, but my wife and I enjoy going interesting places. And journalism, I still get a chance. I did a column for the Business Journal, and so I still get a chance to do those things from time to time.
When you travel to other countries, have you ever visited a courtroom in session?
Oh yes, absolutely. Quite a long time ago, I went in to watch a court of appeals in London. Now, the interesting thing about the fabulous thing simply to see, they've changed it now. Britain now has a Supreme Court. It used to be that the highest court of Great Britain was the House of Lords, and the highest actual court was a committee of the House of Lords. And so you would go in to watch a case being argued, and the only people in the room wearing robes were the lawyers. They weren't literally, they would wear capes, small capes, mm-hmm. and tops, white caps. Not the people here in the case, because they were committee members. So on the other side of the people at the bench, so to speak, didn't sit at a bench. They sat at a series of tables, like they were part of a committee hearing mm-hmm. a request for an increase in sewer rates or something. I mean, just
Were they barristers or solicitors by training?
I think you would be a barrister. That difference has sort of merged over time. But yes, I saw, and occasionally when I would travel, this was probably after I'd made the lawyer decision, but I'd find myself someplace and I'd look around and say, well, where is the court in this town? And
some of the most beautiful buildings are the court.
Frequently so. I remember going to I found one in. We had gone to Nantucket, and just for 3 or 4 days, and I discovered that there was a court in Nantucket. It's not a very big place, really. So I decided to go down and watch the court. And wouldn't you know, talk about here's the combination between law and everyday living. The case I sat in on was a dispute. It was a preliminary hearing in a divorce case, but the thing that was being disputed on was who had to move out of the house, because the property values in Nantucket were so high that the income of the people who were divorcing wasn't enough to pay for 2 places to live. So who has to move out was something you had to go to court over. And I thought to myself, well, that tells me I'm not in Des Moines.
Did being a judge, was that a goal of yours, a career goal?
No.
Ever to be justice? Like, boy, I'd really like to do that.
No, never.
So when it was offered to you, to be on the Supreme Court, and then you became Chief Justice later, did you go, what, me? Huh?
How did this happen? Well, I know exactly how it started. A friend of mine named Ann Walker sat me down in the summer of 1980. I had just lost the election for mayor of Evansville the following fall. And I was doing some law practice on my own. Ann said, have you heard that there's an opening coming on the Superior Court? And I said, yes. And she said, are you going to apply? And I said, no. She said, yes, you are. And she sat me down on the steps. I know exactly where they are. I went by them a couple of weeks ago in Evansville. Ann Schmidt, her name was at that moment, Ann Schmidt, talked me into it. And so I became a trial judge, and I enjoyed that enormously, and thought about sort of normal career advancement led me to ultimately to apply for the Supreme Court.
Did that help soften the blow of losing in 79?
Probably. I've never actually thought of it that way.
You can still serve, that
yeah,
sort of
maybe so. I didn't lose by much. It was a pretty close election. On the day I was sworn in, I think this was on the day I was sworn in as Chief Justice. One of the people who attended was Mike Vanderveer, who had defeated me in the mayor's race, and whoever introduced him as the man who made it all possible. So he and I, and there's an example. He and I don't see each other every very long time, but we stand and just chat. Where you've been headed, and what are you up to? I'm happy to. I still say there's a lot more of that in Indiana than Indiana gives itself credit for.
Did you have a particular judge or justice, either like at the micro level, county or state, let's say, or the macro level, Justice Harlan or someone like that, who you studied or admired the most?
The chief judge of the Superior Court when I was there was a gentleman named Terry Deach, who was just a splendid human being and was admired, very, very humble and quiet. But you learn things. I would actually, if I had, even after I got on the court, I would go, and if I had a spare hour or two, I'd go and watch Judge Deach, just see how does he run a courtroom? How does he rule on motions and that sort of stuff?
One of our previous guests, we've had several lawyers on the podcast, but the two that stand out for me are Jim Voiles.
Yes.
And Judge Sarah Evans.
Yes, my goodness.
Parker. I asked them how you deal, you go through law school, you're basically kind of in the same community, and you butt heads. And how do you treat your friends? And how do you rule against things that is that just something that you weigh as part, not let me say this the right way, to accept the positions that put you in a place of authority, knowing that your friends, people are going to come before you? Is that something that worried you ever?
You do have to think about it sometimes, and you have to ask yourself, is this a case where I shouldn't hear the case? I had one time where two lawyers came to see me wanting to know if I would preside in the divorce case, and they were representing both sides, and they said, our clients have agreed. We have sought a new judge from the one who was originally assigned, and we have a chance to recruit somebody. That's one of the things that the parties can do under the rule, if they can come to an agreement, is try to get somebody. Would you do it? And the difficulty was that they were both people that I had known both of them since I was a teenager, and I didn't see. I worried about whether I could be fair, but more than that, I worried about whether in the end I was going to lose one of them as a friend. Mm. And there are times when you have to do that. You just have to look at somebody and say, "I'm sorry, what you're asking isn't the legal solution to this problem," and you just have to. But I declined because I knew I'd worry about that in ways that I probably I shouldn't do.
I asked the great Jim Voiles, and he is spectacular lawyer and spectacular man. Yes. Wonderful.
Yes.
Before and then, it was about the time I was interviewing, and it was Danielle Shockey who leads the Girl Scouts. We interviewed Sue Ellen Barker or Sarah Evans Barker together, and then I subsequently had lunch with her a few times.
Oh my!
And she's a hoot, to say the least. Since I'm not in her courtroom, I can say that. Yeah. Alternatingly sweet, sour, and always to the point.
Well, and I think one thing judges need to do is to be out and about. One of the things I would say, and people repeat this back to me, who were judges, trial judges, when I was chief. Somebody came up and I don't actually remember saying this, but it sounds like something I would have agreed with. She said, "You told us to get out from behind the bench and get some reforms made." Because judges are in a position to do that. That's not, people outside the profession wouldn't normally think of it that way. But there are plenty. We recruited judges to help us with the plain English jury instructions, right? And in fact, we recruited an English teacher as a consultant. We wanted somebody whose whole life was built on communication. And I think that I said the other day that spending your career with lawyers is a really first-rate thing. I said the sentence I had was lawyers. We all know lawyers enjoy everything from Chat GPT to canoeing. I mean, they're interesting folks on the average, and you get to hear interesting propositions, interesting stories, and learn new things, and to do projects with them.
In 2007, you formed half of a dynamic duo with former Governor Joe Kernan.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Right.
On the Kernan Shepard Commission that was, I guess, put together by Governor Daniels. Mm-hmm. It's a way to reform government, modernize it. I was the communications director at the Indiana Republican Party at the time, and I had to do several interviews about it. I thought the work you all did, it should have just have been approved by acclamation. How honored were you to be with Joe Kernan, a true Hoosier legend, who you knew, obviously? What did you think about the work, and were you disappointed in kind of how it turned out?
Being with Joe Kernan is just a marvelous experience. I said that if you were going to be remembered in part for being at the back end of a hyphen, how could you beat having Joe Kernan at the front end? Right? That's just the way it was, and it was a wonderful experience. And I attended the unveiling of his bust in the State House a few weeks ago.
Your friend Kevin Murray strong-armed me into making a donation?
Yeah. Well, you're at this ceremony, of course, they had the bust was there, and his Maggie and the children were all right tied in, and he had mostly sisters, but he had a younger brother, and the younger brother spoke briefly, and he said, and the story was that they never showed us this bust until now. Even the family has not seen it. He said, I know that Joe would, I know what Joe would say, Even though I don't know what the bust looks like, he said, the younger brother. I don't know what the bust looks, but I know what Joe will say. He'll say, "Couldn't you have put more hair on top?" We had a wonderful circle of members on that study commission, and I changed my mind about a number of things as we went on and explored things that I thought needed further exploration. In terms of outcome, I'll say two things. One is I'm very encouraged at how often it still comes up. Within the last 2 or 3 sessions, there have been bills introduced to adopt various parts of our report, which means, we're not done yet. And the other thing is that more happened than I never expected we'd get 100%. And actually, Mitch Daniels ultimately did a checklist. Which one of these did we do all or part of, and which ones did we not get done? And it's actually better than most people think. I found myself. This is something I found myself on election day once. This is half a dozen years ago. I must have been going in and out of a sandwich place or something, but a gentleman who was a firefighter saw me coming in and stopped me and said, "Thank you for Randall Shepard." And I said, "Well, you're welcome. Why has it interested you?" And he said, "It has been a force for change in the organization and operation of Marion County firefighting." They made some serious changes about laws on nepotism and who you could hire and who you couldn't hire, or mostly who you couldn't hire, relatives and of a certain closeness and that sort of thing. So I rate it as no, not 100%. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, and still is a little bit on townships. But townships, in terms of the financing, are not a huge part of the public budget. And from time to time, there have been some changes up and around Lebanon and Zionsville. Some of those governments have shifted how they're organized and joined together in one way or another in a way that people didn't think about 15 years ago. So it was a great experience, and you got to leave something for the next crowd.
We have a few more minutes with former Chief Justice of the Indiana Supreme Court, Randy Shepard. Do you have a favorite law movie, courtroom drama? We talked about Law and Order, but I always like to ask lawyers and historians, do you have a favorite history movie or a favorite?
Well, one that one that I pretty much will always watch when it rolls around on TV is the one about the Scopes trial.
Inherit the Wind?
Inherit the Wind, yeah. I can, given some time, I quote a bunch of that. What's the great line? I had a nice, she says, when the reporter shows up, there's a woman comes up to him and says, if you need a nice place to stay, I can recommend something. And he looks at her and says, "Madam, I had a nice place to stay, and I left it to come here."
Should say that is Spencer Tracy.
That's Spencer. Yeah, I think so.
There's so many wonderful movies that deal with the law, the verdict, witness for the prosecution.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Oh, I've watched that a lot of times.
12 Angry Men.
Yeah.
Did that
witness for the prosecution
help you? I mean, some of these movies are 50, 60 years old now. Did you see those and go, I want to be a part of that? Because I'm convinced that a lot of folks see things younger, and then when they get older and have a chance to do exactly what they enjoyed watching while they were younger, that influence stays.
I've never thought that it had, but you could be right. It could be. I had actually never been in a courtroom until I went to law school, and I came back from Connecticut on my first Christmas vacation. I went down to the courthouse in Evansville and sat and watched lawyers and judges. I figured if I'm headed in this direction, I ought to get a close look, and I did. That turned out just fine, but how much that mattered, I don't know.
Were you? I'm going to phrase this because it's meant to be a compliment, Your Honor. So if it doesn't come across as a compliment,
all right. Been there, done that.
Were you satiated with the Indiana Supreme Court? Like, this is perfectly fine. I don't want to go to some federal court or into the United States Supreme Court or do anything else. Like, this is great. I've reached my pinnacle and I'm thrilled. Or was it the direction the other way? Hey, I'd really like to do something else.
Well, I always kept my eyes open, but I sure was having a good time, and I thought we were achieving a lot. Certainly in terms of the decisions themselves, but also in terms of court reform. What can we do to make this larger system? One of the things Chief Justice Rush has been so strong on, and she's absolutely right, are what are now called community courts, problem-solving courts, where there's a specialized docket aimed at people who have displayed a particular problem, like drugs. And they treat them in a way that we also have what are called veterans courts, for people who have a specialized needs. Huh?
How much do we love Dave Serto?
Yeah.
Here on the Leaders and Legends podcast. He's a terrific, as a veteran.
Yeah.
I help him. I do his PR for free. He's a wonderful, wonderful man.
Well, but two things. I was getting old enough so that if I was going to have any other opportunities in my life, I was going to have to retire. And 25 years, I was on the court almost 27. So I decided part of it was, are there other things you can do? And some of those turned out to be absolutely super. And the other thing was that the court, too, needs change. It needs change in personnel every once in a while. To people with different ideas or different experiences can come to the front. And so that's the other thing. I thought maybe it might be time to add a new player.
Without mentioning names, I mean, everyone knows their names, but when you see what happens in D.C. with the confirmation process, what is your opinion of that when you see it? And do you think it discourages people from, maybe the top people, from applying for these critical roles?
I think it is something of a discouragement, though I think many of the best players would be willing to throw themselves into the fire in order to have the chance to make a difference. So it's certainly different. You know, the first person ever to appear in front of a judiciary committee was Sherman Minton.
Oh yeah.
And
was that Eisenhower's?
No, it was Truman.
Truman's cabinet.
Yeah, Truman.
He got in trouble.
I don't remember. Maybe
members of his cabinet got in trouble, and
of Truman's cabinet.
Yes,
yeah, not Sherman Minton. I saw his bust is over in the State House. Right. I saw it just this morning. So before that, for most of American history, there were no hearings. There was simply a vote. And in fact, I read recently that somebody in the 1920s was the first person whose nomination was even referred to a committee. Before that, they simply were on a list of resolutions to be considered by the Senate, and you voted or you didn't.
Last question before we get to the 5 questions.
Uh-oh.
You're a lover of history.
Yes.
You have written a book.
Guilty as charged.
All of us who love our history, including Mr. Spangle, fascinated by the people and the movements, and you wrote a book about that includes history. Please tell the Leaders and Legends podcast audience about it.
Indiana can use all of the new looks at history that we can persuade people to come forward with, and I was not the sole author, but the book that you're thinking of, I believe, particularly focused on different experiences in Indiana history, I give you, for example, it's what was Indiana like in terms of providing free assistance to people who were charged with a crime and didn't have money to hire a lawyer? What's Indiana's history on that? And the answer is it's awfully good.
Pre-Miranda?
Absolutely, way before the federal rules.
Miranda 66?
Yeah, but Miranda's the advisement case. But the Indiana Supreme Court and Indiana government started appointing public defenders in, I think, 1857. And another field where it's valuable to spend some time is Indiana's history on slavery. In Ohio and Illinois, if you had a slave, and it was illegal to have a slave after becoming a state, the state courts in those places, and the federal courts for that matter, took the position that didn't mean you lost ownership. It just meant that eventually the slave was going to work his or her way out of slavery. And Indiana did none of that. And then, year 2 of statehood and year 3, they said it says here there shall be no slavery, and that's what it means. And then of course the slave owners started using indentured servitude, and like 18 months later, the Indiana Supreme Court said, "What part of no don't you get?" So I think those stories are valuable to tell people, particularly young people, about what difference you can make in a life. What difference did it make that Indiana took a completely different look on this than places we consider perfectly respectable, Ohio and Illinois, and even the Continental Congress gets some credit, because I read a story just the other day pointing out that the Continental Congress created the Northwest Territory,
right,
and one of the things it put in the Northwest Ordinance was no slavery, and even though some of the people in the Continental Congress were slave owners, but they aspired to build a better society. And as they were getting ready to do that and create Ohio and Illinois and Michigan and so on, they put that in the Northwest Ordinance. And that's sort of the things. There are reasons. There are plenty of things, Indiana, that we can do better. But there are a lot of things we've done pretty well.
We have reached the point on the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests.
You going to tell me who gave the best answers so I could go pat them on the back?
You had some terrific answers, that's for sure.
Yeah.
One of my favorite coincidences is the fact that, and you'll get this question in a second, I asked Terry Curry, who's a wonderful man, what his first concert was, and he said, Love and Spoonful in the Association in Clues Hall. About 2 months later, I asked Mitch Daniels, what was your first concert? He said, Love and Spoonful in the Association at Clues Hall.
Well, I'm going to have a tough one with that. Let's see.
So we'll start easy. Yeah. What was your first job?
Other than delivering newspapers as a newspaper boy, the first place where I was actually on a payroll was McDonald's Hamburgers. I earned 75 cents an hour in 1970, probably 1960. I started out as a milkshake man, but I later graduated to French fries.
And the milkshake machine was actually working, because it pretty much doesn't ever now.
Yeah.
Number 2.
Yeah.
What was your first concert?
This won't sound nearly as exciting as some of the examples you've just given, but I think the first concerts I really remember were the Evansville Philharmonic in the Veterans Coliseum. And that would have been about 1961 or 2.
You grew up in a time where the music was the best of the best.
Oh, I know. Did you see that about a week ago I saw a flash in the elevator coming up and down where they put little newsy points, and it said, today in 1957, Paul McCartney went to a garden party, and he met somebody he'd never met before named John Lennon. And there you go, off and running.
Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
If you were interested in law, there's a new book called 70 times 7. It is about one of the most famous Indiana cases involving the death penalty for a young girl named Paula Cooper.
Oh, yeah. There was a big Indianapolis Star series of articles about that, yeah.
And it was an international topic of news coverage. And in fact, the Pope wrote to Governor Orr and asked him to commute her sentence. And the governor responded that he didn't want to rule anything out, but he would wait until the courts were done with their work. While that was going on, the Indiana legislature amended the death penalty statute so that you had to have been at least 16 when you committed murder in order to be eligible for the death penalty. Paula Cooper had been 15. They didn't want to disturb any existing cases. Anyway, so it was quite a...
And you were involved in that case?
I was on the Supreme Court that converted it from the death penalty to the maximum number of years under the murder statute. And a new book has been written about that whole case, including about Paula Cooper's family and the Pelkey family. Ruth Pelkey was the one that Paula Cooper and her friends killed. And it's an interesting read in terms of how does society work and how do families work.
Next question. This is going to be tough.
This has been doing pretty well so far.
Well, I like asking lawyers and journalists tough questions.
Yeah.
If you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Gettysburg.
Which day?
Day 3.
So Pickett's charge?
Yeah. I read recently that that Pickett ultimately went into the insurance business. I don't think I'd ever known that. I think I got that right. And that people would occasionally ask him, why did Pickett's charge fail? And his stock answer was, I think the Yankees had something to do with it.
I just finished a book on General Longstreet.
Oh, yeah.
And the author is coming on the podcast.
Ah, outstanding.
Last question. If you could, I'm surprised you didn't say Scopes monkey trial, but
that'd be worthwhile.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
Wow. Gosh. Well, I hope not too many of your interviewees have dawdled as long as I am here.
They almost all do.
They all.
This is where I could say, there's a question pending. There's Mr. Chief Justice.
Right. Give him a break. Dan Coates.
A former podcast guest.
Yes.
Who is actually going to come on again.
Is he? Well.
And the absolute pinnacle of a public servant and a person. There's no nicer, more humble man walking the planet than Dan Coates.
Give him my best and tell him I put him on the list.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmond Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today has been former Indiana Supreme Court Chief Justice Randall Shepard. I cannot tell you how many of your friends have said you've got to talk to Randy. Thank you so much. You were exactly as advertised, and I can't thank you enough for your time.
My privilege. I'm so grateful you're doing what you're doing, not just with me, but with so many other people who are interesting to talk with.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.
This podcast was produced and edited by Chris Spangle and Leaders and Legends, LLC. If you're interested in starting a podcast or taking yours to the next level, please contact us at leadersandlegends.net.